Good day, fellow champions of inclusion. I am AA Ron, and this is the Inclusive Dad Podcast, where we explore inclusion and make it practical. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe, rate, or review the show on your favorite platform. We truly appreciate your feedback and would be honored if you shared the podcast with friends and family who might benefit. If you want to support us in our mission, please click on the link in the show description. Today, my guest is Bibi Pirayesh. How'd I do?
You did great.
Awesome. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
Absolutely. Why don't you just start off by just telling me a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I work as an educational therapist. I think a lot of people, especially depending on your location, may not know what that really is. But I think it's a really important field for people with disabilities or learning, challenges, differences to know about, because it's an incredible resource that I think people don't necessarily have access to. But an educational therapist is someone, it's sort of, I usually kind of make the parallel to occupational therapy or speech language pathology, because those are things that people are more familiar with.
Yep.
So it's sort of in that realm, but it's specific to cognition and learning. So an educational therapist is someone who really understands learning and then understands learning disability. I take a processing skills view of learning. That's kind of my lens. But the job of an educational therapist is to help remediate learning disabilities where possible, and then outside of that to really work around advocacy, modifications, accommodations, navigating the school system, really working with other professionals who are supporting an individual student or adults, because therapists do also work with adults.
Right.
But it's a field that's kind of outside of the public school realm. It's sort of a, because, for example, SLPs can be in a school setting, but therapists usually are not, unless there's been some kind of process where, as I'm sure you're familiar with, and your audience is too, if it's been some kind of legal process where it's been shown that the school is not able to meet the needs of a student, and then it is possible to bring in a therapist that way. Yeah.
Very interesting. So I've never heard the term educational therapist until I read through your stuff. So is it kind of a newer thing, not a newer thing? Can you just explain a little more about it?
It's not necessarily new. I mean, it's a field that really its roots are in Europe, and then it migrated to the US, really as far back as the sort of late 1800s.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily new, but because I think the reason that the field is not as well known is because the governing body, which is the Association of Educational Therapists, does not have licensing in the same way that speech language pathology or occupational therapy does. And so as a result, I think it's sort of a field that you kind of have to dig for in order to know. Although I will say, there are areas like in Los Angeles, for example, or in New York, where people do know about therapy very well. One of my own issues with the field is that because it's something that's in the private sector, it's usually more available to people who have the means for that kind of support. I know that that's something that I certainly in my practice try to push back on, and I know the organization is also concerned with it. But yeah, it's more around the licensing, which is why I think it's not as well known. But it's been around a long time.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, so yeah, my background is I have a daughter. Her name is Cece. She just turned 22, so she aged out of the transition piece of the public education system. And I mean, I've been going to IEP meetings and lots of meetings and stuff, and I've never heard of that, so it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know of anybody in Minnesota that does that kind of stuff, or is there like a list somewhere where you can look it up? Or?
I don't know off the top of my head, but if you go to the association's website, which is aetonline.org, I think they have a place there where you put in your zip code.
Okay.
And they tell you, who's in your area.
I'll have to look it up.
Yeah.
So let me start off with, what is your definition of inclusion?
Woo! Starting off really with the hard questions. Okay. So to me, okay, well, I'll sort of answer this my way, and you can tell me how it kind of aligns with maybe your definitions. But I really think that inclusion is something that comes out of power structures and systems that are inherently ableist. So when you have an inherently ableist, I would say, ideology that then manifests the system, is when you begin to ask questions about inclusion. Because when that is not the case, when everyone's value is based on just just being, as opposed to a system that's sort of like categorizing everyone along some metric that's then aligned with a power structure, you're not going to be asking questions about, well, why isn't this person included? Every person is a member of a community, and is, by definition, a valued member of that community. But unfortunately, because our ideologies and our systems don't begin that way, we've created an education system where the question of inclusion becomes central. So I guess you could say that in some ways, the inclusion is really a critique of the systems that we have.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense to me, because like I told you a little bit off camera, my daughter, she's diagnosed with cerebral palsy, epilepsy, uses a wheelchair. So on the IEP jargon, she qualified as severely multiply impaired was her category. So just, I didn't know anything about disability special education before, she was born and was in the special education system. So I just went along with what the school said, visit her at lunch early on in her schooling and saw the other kids were folding towels already, like in kindergarten, first grade. And I was like, why are they not in reading class or math class? I mean, we're already, feeling like they're not going to be able to do that stuff, this young. That's not okay. So found out about inclusion, and then kind of my definition is like full inclusion. So I want her in with the gen ed kids, experiencing the same stuff. I'm obviously like modified accommodations, all that stuff. It's just we struggled with, that was our definition, but the school, if you say their definition, was not the same. So like you're saying, the system had stuff built into it, where it was just not, like, seemed like we were the first people, with a child with that label possibly, that just wanted them to be included. So it was a lot of pushback, a lot of struggles that we went through. So yeah, I can. And like I said, our definition was here, theirs was here, and it was a struggle to get to the same place.
Yeah, and it's you could probably speak to this. I feel like as exclusionary as our school system is, it is a reflection of the larger society and the larger culture.
Yeah.
Because this is something that people with disabilities have to struggle with across the continuum, not just in school.
Yeah.
My belief is that school and the classroom is actually probably the most important place, the most important site to fight those cultural norms, and to really teach kids how to view difference differently. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Our
Yeah.
classrooms and our laws, our legal system is kind of reflective of our larger societal beliefs about difference.
Yeah. I would agree with you. Yeah. It's not like school is the only place where, the inclusion thing. I mean, for my daughter, I mean, there's still sidewalks that don't have curb cuts. There's still buildings she can't get into with a wheelchair, which should not even be an issue. So, I mean, yes, it's just a small piece of the larger societal stuff for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, unfortunately, we live in a. I mean, all you have to do is look at the law, right? Like look
Right.
at the special education law, and you can see it's very clear that it is not about inclusion. It's about
Yeah.
access, which is like a very bare
Yep.
minimum. And even that really, like the burden is placed on parents.
Yeah.
So if you are a parent of, if you're educated, if you know your rights, if you
Yeah.
have the means, and if you're willing to go out there and fight,
Yep.
that's one thing. But if not, then too bad.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not just culture, it's like actually written into the law that way.
Yeah. So, how did you get started in this field, or what made you want to do it?
I actually came to all this in a very, I think, different way than most. I think a lot of people who go into educational therapy are former teachers or special education folks, or people who've sort of always
Right.
been um, interested in that, or people who in their childhood have had an experience with learning disability or had
Right.
a learning disability. I came to it very differently. I mean, I've always been interested in learning,
Mm-hmm.
just from a research perspective. I do come from a family of educators, but I was always interested in kind of like, well, how does this all happen? And are we teaching, is our teaching reflective of how human brains actually learn?
Right.
So I did my undergrad in neuroscience and education. I did my master's degree in developmental psychology and cognitive science. I worked in research. But then it just always bothered me that there is no connection between the two. Like the research doesn't make it into the actual classroom experience. And I really happened upon a therapy. After grad school, I moved, and I was kind of having one of those, like, let me get a job until I figure out my next
Yep.
steps, thinking I was going to go back to school and, keep going in research and doing a doctorate degree. And so I took a job working with kids, specifically working with kids with learning disabilities. Had no idea what educational therapy was, had to get trained. And immediately, like from minute one, I was like, oh, this is where the research and the practice actually connect.
Mm-hmm.
Because we, the center that I was at was really putting in cutting edge research to help kids with their learning, and I just immediately kind of fell in love with it, and it changed my trajectory. I didn't go back to school for more research, and I really went into the practice realm.
That's cool.
So yeah, I came at it a different way, but I think that actually has worked to my advantage because I think one of the drawbacks of being trained in education is that you are so hyper focused on curriculum and on what is supposed to be taught, as opposed to what is going on with the child.
Right.
Um, so yeah, that psychology background really helped me with that.
That's awesome. Why do you view learning disability as a social justice issue?
Well, I mean, it so is, like, at every single level it is. It sort of goes back to, I think, how I was defining kind of inclusion,
Yeah.
in terms of like this really is about our relation to power. So
Yeah.
usually when we talk about social justice in the U.S., people think of it in terms of race, but I think that um, disability kind of runs across all the different isms.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think, in a culture that is as ableist and capitalist and, kind of faking meritocracy and all of that, as much as ours is, disability is truly something that furthers and furthers and furthers you from any kind of
Right.
social or personal power. And so immediately becomes, I think, a social justice issue. But I think at the same time, it has incredible power because all of us, right? All of us, just by virtue of going to school, have had experience with that.
Right.
And I think that people can sort of talk about it and understand it. I mean, obviously, disability is very political, but they can talk about it and understand it in a different way than, for example, race or,
Right.
Sexism. And so I think it sort of has this incredible ability to connect everyone around this very, very political social justice issue of, like, how do we really view difference, and what does that mean for us as a nation, for us in our schools, as communities. So I think it's actually a social justice issue that, to me, kind of like rises above everything else and has the power to bring everyone together to think about it in a way that
Sure.
other issues don't. So a big part of my kind of mission and passion is to talk about that as much as possible, because I think
Mhm.
one of the things that happens for not just individuals but for families who are dealing with disability is when they begin to really understand that and embrace that, they recognize how important their job is, and what an important role they're playing in their community. um, and that then I feel like that sort of helps with how difficult it is to navigate all this, because you recognize that you're not just doing it for your own material conditions but for
Yeah.
everybody else's too.
Right.
um, so yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, because part of the reason, kind of what I, talk about it and, make people more aware of it, is just the things that, we came across in my daughter's journey in school. It's like, how is this like, this is way after the laws are passed. How is this still happening? And then I'm like, I have to bring it up because it seems like nobody else is. So like, that's part of it. I bring it up and, make people aware of things that are happening, and hopefully we can, by bringing it up, we can move the needle. I got crazy stories. We had a brand new fifth, sixth grade school built in our town. So I live in southern Minnesota, a town of like 25,000 people.
Mm.
They built a fifth, sixth grade school, and my daughter, I can't remember if she went into it in fifth grade or sixth, but she did go there. So before the school was built, there was meetings with architects that were open to the public for the school. I attended, and I asked them point blank, is the school going to be ADA compliant? And the architects, well, yeah, it's 20 years or whatever after ADA. Of course it is going to be. And I'm like, well, the reason I'm asking is when the school district remodeled the science labs in the middle school, they didn't make any of the stations wheelchair accessible.
Mm-hmm.
So the only way my daughter can access them is the homemade plywood ramp they built to put her chair up on so she could access it. So fast forward a little bit, they were going around showing the plans at parent teacher conferences. So I watched one of those, and I was looking up at the screen, and on the screen it said special education entrance. And I was like, what does that say? They're like, special education entrance. So they built a brand new school in my daughter's lifetime that had a door labeled special education entrance. And I had to argue with the principal for her to be able to go through the main door, because they thought it'd be safer for her to go in through the side door. And I'm like, no, she does. If she goes to Walmart, there's not a separate door for her to go in for with a wheelchair. Like, why do you have a separate door for her?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
mean, stuff like that in my daughter's lifetime is just crazy that stuff like that still happens.
Yeah. And I think one of the really unfortunate things for people who don't have personal experience is that, like, we sort of think like, oh, like, we have the ADA, or, we
Yep.
have IDEA. So that means, like, we've solved this issue,
Right.
right? We're
Yep.
like in a post, uh,
Yeah.
kind of like thinking like, oh, well, we had, Brown versus Board of Ed. So there's
Yep.
no more racism in schools. Like,
Right.
it's, people don't recognize that every single day is a fight,
Yep.
in order to get the most basic things, like exactly like you said. So, entering into the school becomes this big
Yep.
political issue, because everything is designed by people who are able-bodied,
Yep.
neurotypical, and there is no, we don't, and going back to your original question about inclusion, and the issue of social justice and proximity to power. So people with disabilities are not part of the decision-making process. They're
Yep.
not part of, the architect or whoever it is
Yep.
that their voices are not being heard at that level. And
Right.
so people without those disabilities are making all of these
Right.
decisions and thinking that they're doing, their kind of outlook, which is usually um, almost like a charity
Right.
kind of based outlook.
Yep.
They don't get it. They don't get it. So yeah,
Yeah.
that doesn't surprise me. I think so many people are shocked to find out, for example, that people don't have access to wheelchairs in
Yeah.
our country, or how expensive
Yeah.
wheelchairs can be.
Yep.
They just they don't recognize that. They don't realize. They just think it's like, oh, of course, it's like available for everyone. It's like,
Yeah.
no.
No.
Yeah.
No, that is a great point though. So my partner, we've been together 3 years, and she was not around anybody with a disability to the level she is now. With my daughter being around sometimes, so she said basically exactly what you said. She's like, I knew there was ADA, so I thought everything was fixed. It wasn't until we were together and she was around my daughter that she's seen all the places that aren't accessible. Just because my daughter loves music, so we go to places to listen to music, and the one of them we had to wait for them to go grab a portable ramp to put down so we could get to where we needed to go. It wasn't built in, so you have to ask somebody to make it accessible, and then there was a hole in the ramp and just crazy stuff. And so yeah, exactly what you said. People hear there's a law, figure that it's it must be fixed, and that's definitely not the case.
Not the case, no.
No.
And these are things around like visible, tangible disabilities, whereas learning disabilities, which are not visible,
Sure. Yep.
are even that much harder to
Yeah.
to advocate for, because people are just like, what's the problem?
Yeah, that's true.
So yeah, the laws are not only have they not really addressed the issues in truly meaningful ways, I would go so far as to argue that they have been written in such a way that actually prevents inclusion in many instances. So yeah.
So do you have any tips for parents? So our situation, like I said, is we wanted our example was we wanted our daughter to be more included and kind of hit that roadblock with the school. Do you have any tips for parents when they're maybe have differences of what they want for their child versus what the school is telling them, and how to be successfully advocate for their child?
Yeah, unfortunately, again, I think one of the things that is really shocking for parents when they first come to this world is that they tend to kind of trust the school system. They're like, oh, well, they're educators. Of course, they want the best for my child. And my point is not to say that educators don't, but the system that they have to operate under, is still, at the end of the day, money is at the
Yep.
center of all of it. So it's really unfortunate for me to have to say this, but I would say don't expect the school to be on your side. I think, one of the things that I see in my practice a lot is people have just been trusting the school,
Yep.
and it's just getting worse and worse. And, they are like, but it's natural, right? Because people don't, it's natural to put your trust in
Yep.
the education system, just like you would with, let's say, the medical system.
Yep.
But it's important to recognize that, unfortunately, it's sort of, the law has set things up so that we're at odds. And so that would be my number one thing, is to recognize that. And then number two is, I would say, get support. I think it's very difficult to navigate it on your own. Especially, I think just, sometimes people are like, well, I can't afford this, or I can't. First of all, advocates are available,
Yep.
free of charge. There are many resources. But even if you can't get all of that, like even if you were to take like a family member with
Yep.
you to a meeting, that immediately makes you feel more supported. And it also, I think, makes the other side recognize that,
Yep.
they can't just, give you the
Yep.
runaround. So I would say, if you can do a little bit of research in your community, see if there are advocates available. And if not, then, still, take someone with you.
Sure.
And then my third thing is that, you cut yourself some slack. I would say, you are fighting in a system that is purposefully set up against you.
Yeah.
So, be gentle with yourself. It's frustrating. Once you're in this, you're sort of in it for the long haul. So just, recognize that, manage expectations around that, but then also know that you're not alone, because there's been an incredible community of people who've been fighting this for decades.
Yep.
And try to access that as much as possible.
Yeah, that's all great stuff. I also help, families, as an advocate. And that's one thing I said, like what you said, is just, I don't know if you should always bring somebody with you to the meetings, but I mean, just, it's crazy just how having somebody else with you there, it just, to me, you can feel the power balance shift slightly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it doesn't level it, I don't think, but
Yeah.
I mean, they act, the school staff act differently if somebody else is there.
I agree.
It's crazy.
I agree. Yeah. And if it's someone who, again, even if they're not a professional, even if it's like another parent at the school who's already kind of been through this, I think it could be hugely helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because I mean, my daughter, based on her needs, I mean, it wasn't uncommon to have like 10 people sitting on the school side with everybody. So then it's just me and her mom on the other side, and it's just, you walk in there and it just doesn't feel right. I mean, you just feel like you're at a
It's so
Sure.
intimidating. Yeah, it's so intimidating, and you have to sign stuff, and they ask you all these formal questions, and you're like, it's just not something that you expect in a school setting.
Yeah, for sure. And I think you also touched on a little bit, like I kind of call it, for some reason, I've had the view of like, teachers, medical professionals, like I couldn't question them. So for, I don't know where it came from in my upbringing, but I didn't feel comfortable questioning them until some stuff happened. And I'm like, no, she's my daughter. I mean, I'm around her more than they're around her. I mean, I'm going to ask questions, bring stuff up. I mean, it's on them if they don't like me asking questions. So, but before that, it's just, you're sitting there and something doesn't make sense, but like, I can't, in my brain, I'm like, I can't question them. They're teachers. They know what they're talking about.
Right.
It's wrong. And
it's that authority. Yeah, they do command a certain level of authority. They're the professionals, right? But again, like you said, it's so important to remember that actually you're the expert on your child, and your child is the expert on themselves. Yeah.
When I was looking through your stuff, I came across the Difference is Not Deficit project. Do you want to talk a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, sure. It's sort of something that's taken on different forms, I think. It's actually, I'm currently working on a book of the same
Okay.
name, so I think it's also going to go in that direction. But it sort of, it grew out of the pandemic, and how isolated. I mean, I feel like families who are dealing with these things are already kind of isolated, but then once the pandemic happened, it was like on a whole other level. And I would work with parents and everyone just felt so alone. And so it grew as a project of like bringing people's stories together so that they can see that they're not alone in this.
Yeah.
But it's actually since grown into like a whole other line of advocacy and training that I'm now doing. Because another thing that I've really come to realize in my practice is that it's not fair that we keep putting the burden on people who are dealing with this. We actually need to put the burden on the systems that are creating
Right.
these problems. And so now it's really become more around offering education and professional development, et cetera, to educators, to mental health professionals, to kind of the other side of the stakeholders around their own ableist
Right.
views and the ways that they need to divest from all of that. So it's kind of like this ever-changing project, but that's
Sure.
the iteration of it that I'm in now.
Yeah, that's great. What is one tip you can share to help our listeners be more inclusive today? And just, I wanted something like simple, doesn't cost money, just something simple they can start doing today to be more inclusive.
To be more inclusive. I think at the very heart of the issue with disability is this tendency of othering. We tend to think that like this is something that happens to someone else,
Right.
not to us. And I think one really good thing to remember is that any of us at any moment could become disabled and could
Right.
become a member of the disability community. And so I think it's really important to always try to think about how would I be behaving if I was on the other side of this right
Right.
now, and to remember that you can be at any second.
Yeah. No, that is a great point. And I've seen statistics where if you just live to like the average life expectancy, I don't even remember, it's like 40 or 50% chance you'll have a disability or need help with something before you pass away. And then if you every 10 years after that additional, it just, if you live to like 90, I don't remember, it's like 75 or 80% chance you're going to
Mhm.
have a disability and need help. So yeah, for sure, it's a great reminder.
Yes, I mean speaking of COVID, I mean that was a disabling event,
Right.
and we certainly live in a country where aging itself,
Right.
has become a disability in many ways. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, yeah.
Is there anything else that you want to talk about that we haven't discussed?
Um, no, like I said, my biggest message to people is to remember that even though it definitely feels like you are alone, you in fact are not.
Right.
There's a disability advocacy community everywhere. You do have to oftentimes dig for it and learn about it, but just remember that I think is really important. And then of course, if there's ever, I always tell people like if there's any way that I can help or support or connect you to people, reach out. I'm always happy to do that.
Yeah. Where's the best place people can connect with you?
The best place, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so that's usually a good way to connect with me. And then my websites. If you're parents in sort of Southern California and you're looking for educational therapy, I have my One of One Kids website. And then if you're a professional who is looking to kind of help lift some of this burden by re-educating yourself, then my website for that is drbbbpirayesh.com. So either of those websites, and they're connected. So if you go to one, you can find the other.
Find the other one. Awesome. I'll make sure I put all that in the show notes. Ready for the last question?
No, do I have a last question? No.
Oh, this is my last question. Do you like spam? Do you like spam lunch meat? Yes or no?
No.
No. Okay.
Sorry.
The reason I asked that question is I live in Austin, Minnesota, where they make spam and where the spam museum is located. So I've been asking all my guests to see, and it's usually like just happened. It's either a strong yes or a strong no. There's usually never a middle ground.
And never a middle. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm an immigrant, so I learned about spam after immigrating here when I was 10.
Okay.
And I will never forget how shocked I was by the whole idea of meats in this container. I was so confused by it. So yeah.
Fair enough.
But if I were there, I would go to the museum. I would.
Yeah. Well, if you ever come to southern Minnesota, you should go. It's pretty fun. I mean, I've been there. It's interesting. So, well, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Absolutely. And thank you for this amazing platform that you have for people.
Thanks. To all of you listening, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Inclusive Dad Podcast. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please subscribe, rate, or review the show. Your feedback helps us connect with more champions of inclusion. Remember to share this podcast with friends and family who might benefit. If you want to support us in our mission, please click on the link in the show description. Together, we can make the world more inclusive. Until next time, stay empowered and be a champion for inclusion.